Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Little from mypokercoaching.com, and today we are going to be discussing why position means everything. Whenever the cards are initially dealt, the player on the dealer is essentially the player who's putting out the cards. They deal one card to every player, they deal another card to every player, and then the small blind is posted and the big blind is posted. The small blind puts in whatever the small blind amount is. Let's say we're playing 1-2 no limit hold'em. That means the small blind is going to put in $1, the big blind is going to put in $2. Then the player to the big blind's left, UTG, which stands for under the gun or first position, they have to act first. And then after they act, UTG plus 1 goes. Then the player to their left, UTG plus 2, the player to their left, middle position or Lojack goes, then around to the hijack, the cutoff, and the button. And in this video, we're going to be discussing why it is so bad to be in the early positions and why it is so good to be in the late positions. If you are the player who has to act first, such as UTG, you're referred to as being out of position. And if you're on the button, or whoever gets to act last, especially on the flop, the turn, and the river, you are referred to as being in position. So you need to make sure that you memorize the names of these positions. All of them, I realize it's a bit much, but that's going to allow you to think about poker more clearly and more precisely. So we have the big blind, the small blind, then the button, which has the best position before and after the flop, the cutoff, the hijack, the Lojack, then UTG plus 2, UTG plus 1, and UTG. So what are the advantages of position? Well, first things first, you get to win more pots uncontested. Imagine what happens if you raise from first position. Well, every single player yet to act is going to have a random hand, right? And quite often, if you take your hand against 6, 7, 8, 9 other players' random hands, well, they're going to pick up something some portion of the time. If you're on the button, though, and you raise, you're only raising into the small blind and the big blind, who are going to be out of position against you on the later betting rounds, which is bad for them. So when you're on the button, you just get to win more pots uncontested. Also, consider what happens if, let's say, everyone folds around to you on the button and you raise, and the big blind calls, and the flop comes, whatever it is. The big blind's going to check very often. You're going to put in a bet on the button, and they're just going to fold if they don't have anything. And you win the pot because you're in position and because you used aggression. So, being in position lets you win more pots uncontested. It also lets you control the size of the pot. You essentially get to put in one extra bet on each betting round when you are in position, when you feel inclined. Imagine what happens if the cutoff raises before the flop. Well, if you're on the button, you can either fold, call, or re-raise. And that is very valuable for you. Whereas if you're in the cutoff and you raise, you don't really have any control over if another bet goes into the pot before the flop. And this happens on every post-flop betting round. The player in position always has the option to raise, and that allows them to build the pot when they feel inclined. And in games where the pot grows exponentially, like No Limit Hold'em or Pot Limit Omaha, being in position lets you make the pot huge when you want to, which is very, very valuable. Being in position also lets you take a free card whenever you have a draw that you really don't want to get check raised off of. If the, let's say, cutoff bets and you're in position on the button, you can just call and see the next card. Or if they check, you can just check and not even have to put any more money in the pot and see that card for free. This also, to some extent, applies with your medium strength hand. Say you have top pair bad kicker. Say the cutoff raises, you call on the button. If the flop comes, you really want one or no bets to go in the pot here. So if the cutoff bets, you can just call. If they check, you can either check it back and try to get closer to the showdown, or put in one bet, and if they raise, it's not a good spot, but that's on you for reopening the action. So realize that being in position lets you take a free card when you feel inclined. And finally, being in position allows you to observe far more tells on your opponent. And tells can manifest in all sorts of ways, such as how much your opponent bets. Maybe because you've been paying attention, that your particular opponent bets big when they have a good hand and small when they have a medium strength hand or a bluff. Well, when they bet big, you can just fold almost everything, right? Unless it's a draw, getting the right odds to continue. And when they bet small, you can raise them very frequently and apply a lot of aggression to what is at best a medium strength hand. Or maybe your opponent does the exact opposite. Maybe they bet small with their good hands and huge with their bluffs, and then you can play accordingly. Maybe you know that your opponent puts the chips into the pot very aggressively. They throw them in whenever they're bluffing. Well, if you see that happen because you get to act last, that will allow you to make very, very good decisions. Or maybe they put their chips in a nice little neat pile when they have the nuts. Maybe that's what they do. I don't know. You have to pay attention, right? But being at the table and last to act allows you more opportunities to observe these things and to take advantage of them. So these are the 4 main advantages of position. Understand that the ranges you play should change based on the position that you are in. You should play a wider range as your position improves because you're taking your hand against fewer and fewer random hands yet to act. So like we discussed already, when you are in the early positions, you have to play very tightly. We're going to go through some ranges in just a second to illustrate this. And when you're in the late positions like the button and the cutoff, you get to play far more hands. So play tightly from early position, loosely from late position. Let's take a look at some ranges. Here we have an early position raising range and a middle position raising range. And as we see, the UTG range here is only raising with the absolute best hands. The hands in white are all folded. You're not limping with anything. You're either raising or you're folding. These are charts that are reasonable for something like a 100 big blind deep cash game. So here we're raising with all the pairs, pocket 7s and better, ace 9 suited and better, ace 5 suited, ace jack off suited and better, king 10 suited and better, queen 10 suited and better, jack 9 suited and better, 10-9 suited, and 9-8 suited. Again, everything else is folded. King, queen, ace 10 offsuit, king, queen offsuit, jack 10 offsuit, pocket 5s, it's ace 7 suited. All of these just go right into the muck because remember, you're taking your hand against all the other players at the table and your position is terrible. So you have to fold a lot. From the hijack seat, you get to play wider. Now you get to play 20% of hands. You get 11% from under the gun, 20% from the hijack. Now we get to play all the suited aces, a few more suited connected type hands, and a few more big cards, plus a few more pairs. You may be surprised to see that all pairs are not playable from all positions, but they're not. You may be surprised to see that ace X offsuit, like ace 8 is not playable, but it is not. These hands will get you in trouble, especially from the early positions. As your position gets better, like let's say you're in the cutoff. Remember the cutoff is this seat here. Now you get to play 26% of hands, all the big cards, all the suited aces, lots of suited kings, and lots of suited connectors and gappers, plus all the pairs now. And then from the button, you get to play 40% of hands, or maybe even a little bit more, such as all suited aces, kings, a lot of suited queens, a lot of suited connectors and gappers, and the ace X offsuit, plus some other big and medium cards. So, as you can see here, on the button you get to play 40% of hands or potentially more, and from under the gun you get to play 11%, right? That is a huge difference that you want to make sure you are implementing. Just to be very clear, these charts are for when everyone folds to you. If there's a raiser before you, these charts go out the window, and your strategy will adjust to account for the fact that somebody already announced by raising that they have a decent hand. If there are limpers in front of you, your strategy will also change. These charts are specifically for when everyone folds to you, which may or may not happen all that often in your individual game, but it's a very good starting point. Here we have charts from the small blind. Now, when you're playing a small stakes cash game like 1-2 no limit, very often the casino takes a rake out of each individual pot. If that's the case, you do not want to limp from the small blind because when you limp and the big blind checks, the casino is going to take, if you're playing 1-2, they may take $1 out of that pot, 25% of the pot. And that is a disaster. You can't just give the casino 25% of your money. You cannot win. So you'd much rather raise or fold. And from the small blind, you can raise something like 48% of your hands and put your opponent in a pretty rough spot. From the big blind, we do not have raise first in charts, RFI, because if they all fold to you, you just win the pot, right? So you're always going to be facing a raise when you're in the big blind if you don't win the pot uncontested, which means that your strategy is going to depend on your opponent's tendencies. Now, if you know your opponent in early position is raising with only this range, well, you have to be super duper tight, right? Because their range is very, very strong. However, if they're raising from the button with all this stuff, you get to play a much wider range. So you're going to defend very tightly against the early position raiser and against middle position raisers, but you do get to play much wider against late position raisers. You definitely want to make a point to avoid junky hands though. Hands like Jack 4 offsuit and 8-4 offsuit and 6-3 offsuit and 5-2 offsuit are no good. They should be folded against a raise basically every time. It's also worth noting that as the raise size you're facing gets bigger and bigger and bigger, you should play tighter and tighter and tighter. If you're playing 1-2 no limit and the normal raise size in your game is to $15, 7.5 big blinds, you can play super tight because your opponents are risking so much to win so little. But if they raise to $4, then you have to defend substantially wider because you're getting way better pot odds. Let's discuss one more thing pertaining to position, and that is that you should be very careful in multi-way pots to make sure that you do not have very poor relative position. Let me explain it. Consider what happens if the button raises and you call from the small blind, okay? Let's say the button raises to $6 at 1-2 and you call from the small blind. Now, the big blind has to put in $4 more into a pot that's going to be 18 total. They're getting really good odds, and they're going to call very often. So what's going to happen on the flop? On the flop, very often, you're going to check, the big blind's going to check, and the button's going to bet. And now you, in the small blind, have to act before the big blind. So you have the worst position when you have to check first, and then after a bet, you also have the worst position. The big blind's actually not in that bad of a spot because they get to see what you do first, right? And the problem with this is that you're going to check everything. If the big blind checks everything and the button bets, the big blind could be sitting here with a very strong hand because they would check everything. So this is a really bad spot for you. This was referred to as having very bad relative position, which is why when someone raises before you, you should actually re-raise or fold with a lot of your range from the small blind because you really, really, really don't want to have terrible relative position. This concept to some extent applies to the other positions too, which is again why you have to play tighter and tighter and tighter as you are in earlier and earlier position. The button is the only seat that is guaranteed to have position throughout the pot, which is why they get to play much wider ranges across the board. So that's going to be it for today. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, click the like and subscribe button down below. Also, if you have a horror story about how somehow position went poorly for you one day, feel free to type that in the comments. Good luck in your games, have fun, and I hope you make position work the best for you. Talk to you next time.